Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to show how to capture a higher level of realism when working on smaller drawings. Now my first tip here is to focus on the main features, the main lights and darks first. Now because this was only a 6x8 inch but I'm drawing the entire body, this makes the face and all of the other parts of the drawing far smaller. So making sure that I've got the placement right of my highlights and shadows first is going to make a big difference in how accurate this small drawing looks. Now I would normally do this with graphite powder if I'm working larger, but the face here of course is very small, so I want it to be as accurate as possible, which is why I'm sticking with my graphite pencils for now. Now my next tip, once the darker values have started to be mapped in, is to then focus more on softness. Now using a small paper blend-in stump here, I'm still able to be accurate and only blend the areas where needed, but this level of softness at the base layer stage makes a big difference to how realistic these drawings look. Now my goal here for this small sized portrait is to still create the impression of a black and white photograph, but without adding in lots of detail. I want the contrast and the values to create that shape and form. So this is where the softness and building up my layers gradually are all helping to achieve that. Now the layering process and how we build up these darker shades is very important because it's going to also impact how well the erasers work. Now one of the most common questions I'm asked when using erasers for graphite is why they struggle, why the highlights may not be as light as we want. And I do find that the way the graphite has been applied to the paper is one of the bigger factors. Now if we use too much pressure on the pencil at that first stage and we burnish, which is where we flatten the tooth of the paper, then the erasers are going to have a much harder time to lift that graphite off of the paper. Now for a smaller drawing like this where I am trying to capture the softness and avoid those harsh start and stop points, that putty eraser works very well for those mid-tone highlights. If I need to then lighten my highlights yet again, I can use a battery eraser, a Tombow mono eraser, or there you saw me using my erasing shield. Now the way that we are going to be incorporating these highlights is going to encourage more of the range of values. So I'm not necessarily working light to dark here. Now I do feel that having these darker values in place first and then pulling the highlights over the top, the way that they would naturally be and they catch the top surface of the fur, I feel adds more realism to the drawings. And again, one thing I do want to mention here is there are many different ways to get to the same end. We can adjust the layering process depending on the lighting, the fur texture that we're drawing and so on. But certainly if we're working with more darker values initially, then we need to be making sure that we are doing that in our drawing so that then we're able to incorporate more of that natural layering process. Now I do feel that working with our darker shades for graphite, it does come down to more of the confidence. Having that confidence to put that darker graphite in place, knowing that we can lift it as long as the correct layering process has been used. Now this is a key part of my real-time step-by-step lessons. I do focus on the layering of that graphite and the pencil technique from start to finish. Now I do record all of my real-time voiceovers whilst I'm drawing, so I'm able to explain everything in the moment. So it makes even the most complex subjects easier to tackle. If my real-time lessons are of interest, I'll link the information to those in the description below. Now when working on a smaller scale, we're able to practice some of the techniques such as the layering and capturing good contrast without that pressure that we're going to have to spend many days on that portrait. Whether or not we're worried about making a mistake and then ruining all of those days previous of that work that we've put into it. And a key part of this drawing was also capturing the movement. Now this also relies on the correct placement of the highlights and shadows. But if this is something that you're newer to capturing in your drawings, a little study like this is really worthwhile. This may be a good practice piece before attempting to draw this on a much larger scale. Now when drawing limbs, hands or feet, they can very quickly take on a bit more of a stranger shape if the placement of the highlights and shadows are incorrect. Now, most of the time, an obvious shadow or highlight is going to be over one of the main joints in the body. For example, here where the back leg, that knee is bent up, it's pushing the hip further up as well, and that therefore is creating this shadow, those slightly darker creases where the skin and the muscle is then being compressed. So when I'm working with this movement here, I'm paying very close attention, but just to that one small area of the reference photo. I don't want to start getting carried away here and making those shadows or highlights too big, because ultimately then I'm going to change the shape of the leg. Now, when I'm working on these smaller drawings, I'm paying attention to more of the obvious lights and darks in each of the smaller areas, rather than trying to draw in all of them. Now, the reason being purely is that we don't have the space, so it's going to look more realistic if we only focus on the main ones that we see. As long as there's the softness there with the midtones, it's still going to look realistic. Now, if you are newer to drawing movement, and as I say, the legs, hands and feet of any animal or person, I really would recommend to break it up into one section at a time. It's very easy if we block in the entire leg that then it becomes either too straight, the joints might then look too rounded, it may not have the correct angle. So I usually do like to work with the top of the leg, the midsection and then the foot, so that I'm able to then break it up into manageable chunks. If I can get each section looking realistic before I move on, I know then that the leg is going to look more natural to that reference photo. Now, before I move on to drawing the legs, I just wanted to reinforce more of my contrast. Now, this is a key process of any drawing regardless of the size. We don't want to call it finished too soon. If we feel like we need to make the highlights a little bit brighter or the shadows darker, it's always worthwhile to spend those additional minutes getting that right. You can see here that it's adding a lot more shape and form to the subject. Now, for the highlights at this stage, where I want to have a little bit more control with the option of pulling in a little bit more of those lighter values, I'm using my Tombow Mono Eraser. Now, one thing to bear in mind with this is if you use too much excessive pressure, it actually does make the eraser tip spread out just a fraction, and the lines can actually look thicker than you may want. And also, if you're not cleaning the erasers off regularly, you can actually end up putting the graphite back onto your paper, because with more pressure on that eraser, you're forcing that graphite into the paper again. So it is something there to bear in mind. Now, one quick tip, if you're drawing longer hair, such as this on a smaller drawing, then we don't want to add in every single strand that we can see in the reference photo. In this situation, that is applied to the mane and the tail. Now, if I try to add in every individual strand, the wispier hairs, then I'm going to actually make this look a little bit wiry and the hair will have a bit more coarseness to it. Because on this smaller drawing, you just don't have the space to add all of them in. The hair can sometimes look a little bit spaghetti-like. So I still want to capture the softness, and if I need to have less pencil strokes here, but still got the variation with the way that the hair is travelling, then that's always going to be my preference. This is definitely one of those situations where less is more. There's going to be more impression of detail here because of the difference in that hair texture, but I certainly don't want to overdo it. Now onto the final part of this drawing and the legs. Now this is where it can get confusing very fast. So as you can see here, I'm using the same process by blocking in my darker shades first. Now a couple of minutes ago, I mentioned that if you are working on the leg, that you can break that up into smaller chunks, do the top, the middle and the bottom at different times. But working on a smaller scale, if you're more confident with drawing limbs, then we can use more of an entire layering process. But I want to be making sure that I'm still breaking it up where needed. So once I've hinted at my lights and darks with my graphite powder, I'm then reinforcing it with my pencils. But my biggest tip for this is not to jump into your darkest pencils first. You can see here that I'm really building up those shades and I'm gradually making them darker. Now, one real advantage to this is that then we're not committed if we do make a layer too dark or we add a light and dark variation in the wrong place. Now, if we work with our darkest pencils early on and then we realise we've gone too dark, that actually adds additional stress to the drawing process, especially if you're newer to the medium. So really working with one layer at a time enables us to slow that drawing process down. Now, drawing the feet of any animal is one of the areas where we do want to make sure we've got the shape right. Now, because of how this foal is running, the shape of the hooves, it does change slightly with the angle. So this is something that I always want to focus on. Even if a horse is standing still, the way that the angles of the hooves are sloped, if there's grass that's overlapping and so on, all of these things here do need to be paid attention to make sure that the feet haven't been rushed. Now, even if someone doesn't have the reference photo, it's very obvious if the feet are drawn incorrectly. It's the same with noses. If the nostrils aren't right, it's very obvious and it's quite distracting. So we do want to be making sure that each section of this is given the right amount of time. Really study that reference photo where needed. Now, another tip for drawing limbs or fingers is that we don't want to get into the habit of adding the same highlight and shadow in the same place as the other leg. So here, for example, the highlights and shadows on the front legs are different to the back legs because of how they are bending in different angles. We want to be making sure then that we are studying each limb individually. And maybe, for example, one of the front legs may be actually blocking out some of the light and casting a shadow onto one of the back legs. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I do upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to this foal or any of my other step-by-step lessons, I will link all of the information to those in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.